August 1944. A farmhouse cellar somewhere in the Bocage country of Normandy. Hauptmann Werner Kolb has been an infantry officer for 4 years. He has fought in France in 1940, when the Wehrmacht moved so fast that supply columns struggled to keep up with the advance, and the war felt like a controlled fall forward, exhilarating, unstoppable, finished before the enemy understood what was happening. He has fought in Russia, where the war was something different and darker, where the distances swallowed armies and the winters had opinions about which civilization deserved to survive them. He is not a man who frightens easily. He is not a man who uses imprecise language. He is, by training and temperament, a professional. He is hiding in a farmhouse cellar with 11 men because there is a Sherman tank in the courtyard that he cannot kill, and an American infantry platoon behind the tank that he cannot flank because every time he tries to move a squad into the hedgerow on the left, something finds them. Not the tank, not the infantry. Something behind both of them that he cannot see and cannot locate and cannot suppress, because by the time he identifies the source has moved or the rounds have already arrived. He does not know the word for what he is experiencing. The word, in the technical vocabulary of the American military, is combined arms. But Kolb does not need the vocabulary. He has the experience, which is more precise than vocabulary in the ways that matter to a man in a cellar with 11 soldiers and a tank in the courtyard. Later, months later, in a prisoner processing camp outside Paris, he will try to describe this experience to an American intelligence officer who asks him what made American infantry different from the Soviet infantry he fought in Russia. He thinks for a long moment. Then he says, "Your infantry is never alone. I never once fought just your infantry. I always fought your infantry and everything behind it." The intelligence officer writes this down. He does not yet fully understand what he has been told. This video is the explanation. The problem of combined arms, the coordination of different weapon systems into a unified tactical whole that is more lethal than the sum of its parts, is as old as organized warfare. Every military in history has understood, at some level, that infantry alone is vulnerable, that cavalry alone is brittle, that artillery alone is immobile, and that the combination of all three, properly synchronized, produces an effect that none of them can achieve independently. Understanding this in theory and achieving it in practice are, however, profoundly different things. The history of modern warfare is littered with armies that had excellent individual components and catastrophic difficulty making those components work together. Because combined arms integration requires not just doctrine, but communications, training, trust between different branches, and above all, a shared tactical language that allows an infantryman to speak to an artilleryman and be understood quickly enough for the information to be useful. The German army that invaded Poland in 1939 was at that moment probably the best integrated combined arms force in the world. The Blitzkrieg concept, which was less a formal doctrine than an operational culture, demanded and produced precisely the kind of arm-to-arm coordination that traditional military thinking had treated as an aspiration. Panzer commanders, infantry officers, artillery batteries, and Luftwaffe ground attack pilots were trained to function as elements of a single tactical system, communicating on compatible frequencies, operating from compatible doctrines, trusting each other's performance with the confidence that comes from training together and fighting together. This integration was the Wehrmacht's primary tactical advantage in 1939 and 1940. It produced the defeat of Poland, the defeat of France, and the initial devastating successes against the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Results so rapid and so complete that they seem to validate the concept as definitively as any military system had ever been validated by results. Then the war became long. And long war has a specific effect on combined arms integration that the German military did not fully reckon with when it was winning. It consumes the resources that integration requires. Communications equipment wears out and cannot be replaced at the same rate it is consumed. Trained forward observers are killed and replaced with less trained men who cannot read terrain as quickly or call fire as accurately. Fuel shortages ground the aircraft that should be providing close support. Ammunition rationing forces artillery officers to decline calls for fire that they would have answered immediately in 1941. By 1943, the Wehrmacht's famous combined arms integration was degrading. Not uniformly, not catastrophically in a single moment, but progressively, in the way that any complex system degrades when its consumables are not replenished at the rate they are used. At precisely the moment this degradation was accelerating, the American Army was moving in the opposite direction. The U.S. Army that entered North Africa in November 1942 had limited combined arms experience and showed it. At Kasserine in February 1943, the coordination between American infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was poor by any standard. The components were present, but the integration was absent, and the Wehrmacht exploited the gap with the professional precision that was, at that point in the war, still its defining tactical characteristic. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Army had transformed that picture so completely that German veterans would spend decades in post-war testimony trying to find language adequate to describe what American combined arms felt like from the receiving end. The language they kept returning to was not tactical, it was mechanical. The Americans, they said, fought like a machine. What they meant was something more precise and more interesting than that comparison suggests. And understanding what they meant requires looking carefully at the specific system the American military had built, and why it worked the way it did against an opponent who had invented the concept it was now surpassing. The heart of American combined arms effectiveness in the Second World War was not a weapon. It was a procedure. Specifically, it was the Fire Direction Center, the FDC, and the communications doctrine built around it, which by 1944 had transformed American artillery from a powerful but conventionally organized branch into what military historians would later call the most effective fire support system of the war. The Fire Direction Center was, in physical terms, unimpressive. It was a set of radios, a set of firing tables, a plotting board, and a team of trained soldiers, typically 3 to 5 men, whose job was to receive calls for fire from forward observers, compute the firing data needed to put rounds on the target, and transmit that data to the guns. The guns would then fire, the observer would report whether the rounds hit, and the FDC would adjust. The cycle would repeat until the target was destroyed or the observer reported fire for effect. This process sounds straightforward. It was not straightforward in practice because every element of it required trained personnel, reliable communications, and an organizational culture that treated responsiveness to the infantry as the artillery's primary obligation, not secondary to the artillery's own tactical situation, not subordinated to the judgment of a senior artillery officer who might want to preserve ammunition, but primary, immediate, and institutionalized. The American Army, by 1944, had achieved all of this. The FDC at the battalion level could receive a call for fire from a forward observer, compute firing data, and have rounds in the air in 3 to 5 minutes. The German artillery system, which used more centralized fire control procedures and less streamlined communications, typically required 15 to 20 minutes for the same process. 12 minutes. In infantry combat, 12 minutes is not a tactical differential, it is a survival differential. A German infantry squad caught in the open by an American forward observer had, at most, a few minutes of vulnerability before American artillery arrived. An American squad caught by a German forward observer had 15 to 20 minutes to find cover, break contact, or call for its own counter-battery fire. That asymmetry compounded across every engagement, every day, every week of the campaign, into a pattern of attrition that German infantry officers recognized with a specificity that their post-war testimony makes unmistakable. But the FDC was only the artillery dimension of a system that operated on multiple dimensions simultaneously. The second dimension was air-ground coordination, the system that linked American infantrymen in the field to the fighter bombers that German soldiers called jabos and spoke of with a particular kind of dread that their letters home cannot quite suppress, even through the censor's filters. The jabo, the Jagdbomber, the fighter bomber, was not in itself a revolutionary weapon. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang were excellent aircraft, but what made them devastating was not their individual performance so much as the system connecting them to the soldiers on the ground. By 1944, American tactical air doctrine had developed a close air support network that used tactical air control parties, TACPs, attached directly to ground units, equipped with air-compatible radios, trained to communicate with pilots in real time, and positioned far enough forward to observe targets directly. When a German column moved on a road in Normandy, the TACP officer with the nearest American infantry unit could see it, call it in, and have aircraft overhead in 15 to 30 minutes. Aircraft that arrived already briefed on the target's location and characteristics, that could identify ground panels marking friendly positions, and that could deliver ordnance with an accuracy that made movement in daylight on any road within range of American ground forces an act of deliberate risk. German soldiers on the Western Front, after June 1944, developed specific behavioral adaptations to the Jabo threat, moving at night, dispersing vehicles, avoiding roads during daylight hours. These adaptations were not irrational. They were the correct response to a real and lethal threat. They were also, in their aggregate effect, deeply corrosive to German tactical mobility, because an army that cannot move freely in daylight is an army that cannot respond at operational tempo to the situation it faces. The third dimension was armor-infantry cooperation, the specific tactical integration of tanks and foot soldiers that the U.S. Army had gotten badly wrong at Kasserine and had spent the subsequent 18 months learning to get right. The core lesson, learned through blood in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, was that tanks without infantry are blind and vulnerable to close-range anti-tank weapons, and infantry without tanks are exposed and easily pinned by machine guns and light artillery. Together, each solved the other's primary vulnerability. Infantry protected the tanks from close assault. Tanks protected the infantry from the machine guns and fortified positions that stopped foot soldiers in the open. By 1944, American infantry armor teams trained and fought as integrated units at the platoon and company level, with communication procedures, the infantry officer with a radio who could talk directly to the tank commander, that made real-time coordination possible in the chaos of close combat. German Panzer Grenadier doctrine had pioneered this concept. American execution, by the summer of 1944, had matched and, in specific tactical dimensions, exceeded the standard that German combined arms had set. The fourth dimension, less discussed but equally important, was combat engineering. American infantry divisions contained an organic engineer battalion whose primary mission was not construction but tactical mobility, clearing mines, bridging gaps, reducing obstacles, all in direct support of the infantry's advance. German infantry encountered American engineers not as a rear area service that arrived after the fighting to repair what had been broken, but as a frontline element that arrived with the assault to remove what was blocking it. This meant that the obstacles German defenders had constructed, the minefields, the demolished bridges, the roadblocks, were being cleared not eventually, not after a logistical delay, but immediately, as part of the same tactical action that was assaulting the defensive position. The defenders built obstacles. The obstacle clearers arrived with the assault. Hauptmann Kolb, in his farmhouse cellar, was not fighting infantry. He was fighting a system with 4 simultaneous dimensions. And the system had a 5th dimension he had not yet mentioned to the intelligence officer. It never ran out of ammunition. Let the figures speak. By 1944, each American infantry division of approximately 14,000 men contained, as organic elements, 3 infantry regiments, 4 artillery battalions with a combined establishment of 48 howitzers, an engineer combat battalion, a reconnaissance troop, a medical battalion, and a full complement of signal, ordnance, quartermaster, and military police units. The artillery alone, 48 howitzers organic to the division, before the attachment of corps-level artillery, which routinely reinforced division fires, represented a fire support capability that German infantry divisions of equivalent size could rarely match in practice by 1944. American field artillery fired approximately 3.7 million tons of ammunition in the European theater of operations between June 1944 and May 1945. The precision of that figure is itself remarkable. It reflects the record-keeping of a supply system organized well enough to count its own consumption with accuracy. For comparison, German artillery ammunition expenditure in the West during the same period was a fraction of that figure, constrained at every point by production shortfalls, transportation disruption, and the progressive destruction of German synthetic fuel capacity that reduced the mobility of ammunition-carrying vehicles. The radio production figures tell the communication story with equal clarity. American industry produced approximately 15 million military radios of all types during the war, a figure that reflects not just the SCR-300 infantry radio, but the full spectrum of communications equipment from handheld walkie-talkies to vehicle-mounted battalion command sets to the strategic communications infrastructure connecting theaters to Washington. German radio production, constrained by the same raw material and industrial capacity limits that affected every sector of the German war economy, could not approach this volume. German infantry units in 1944 were chronically under-equipped with tactical communications, a shortage that showed directly in the speed and reliability of their combined arms coordination. The Jabo numbers are perhaps the most visceral. Between June 1944 and May 1945, the Allied tactical air forces in Europe flew approximately 2.5 million sorties in support of ground operations. This figure encompasses strategic bombing, interdiction of transportation networks, and direct close air support of ground forces. The close air support component, the missions that put aircraft directly over German ground units in response to calls from American infantry, ran into the hundreds of thousands of individual sorties during the Normandy campaign, and the subsequent pursuit across France and into Germany. German infantry units in this period faced an air threat so consistent and so immediately responsive to ground force requests that their after-action reports, preserved in the German military archives, read, with remarkable repetition across different units, different commanders, and different sectors of the front, as variations on a single theme: movement interdicted by enemy air, attack delayed, vehicle losses to air attack, request for Luftwaffe support denied or not fulfilled. The Luftwaffe in the West in 1944 could not contest the air above the battlefield. It could not protect German ground units from the Jabos. It could not answer the requests in the after-action reports. It had been outproduced, outfueled, and outtrained by an American and British air arm that had spent 3 years building exactly the capability it was now deploying. By the numbers then. American artillery, 3.7 million tons of ammunition in 11 months. German artillery, a fraction of that figure, declining by the week. American tactical radios, 15 million units produced. German tactical radios, chronically insufficient at infantry platoon level. Allied tactical air sorties, 2.5 million in 11 months. German tactical air response to ground requests, largely unavailable by mid-1944. Hauptmann-Kolb's 4 dimensions, artillery, air, armor, engineering, were each backed by production figures that made their consistent, reliable availability not a tactical luxury, but an operational certainty. The German soldier said the Americans always seemed backed by machines. The numbers explain why the machines never stopped. The effect of American combined arms on German soldier psychology was not a single event. It was an accumulation, a weight of daily experience that settled differently on different men, but produced, over time and across units, a consistent and measurable change in how German infantry approached combat against American forces. The primary effect was on risk calculation. Every infantryman, in every war, performs a continuous and largely unconscious calculation about which risks are acceptable and which are not. This calculation is not a formal mathematical exercise. It is an intuitive assessment, informed by training and experience, of the relationship between the action being considered and its probable consequences. Move to that position. How likely is it that the artillery finds me before I get there? Rush that machine gun. How likely is it that I close the distance before I'm cut down? German infantry in 1941 and 1942 performed this calculation against an opponent, the Red Army, that was formidable in numbers and often in courage, but was, in the early years, inconsistent in its combined arms integration. Soviet artillery was powerful, but sometimes slow to respond. Soviet air support was growing, but not yet the ubiquitous presence it would become. Soviet armor and infantry coordination was, in the war's early stages, often poor. The German infantry soldiers' risk calculation, therefore, allowed for a certain operational boldness, an assessment that rapid movement, aggressive action, and the exploitation of fleeting opportunities were viable options, because the system behind the enemy was not reliably fast enough or coordinated enough to punish them every time. Against American forces in 1944, that calculation changed. The American system was reliable. It was not perfect. No tactical system in the history of warfare has been perfect. And there were individual engagements where American combined arms coordination broke down, where the radios failed, or the observer was killed, or the fighter bombers were engaged elsewhere. But the expectation of American combined arms was consistent enough that German infantry officers began factoring it into their planning as a certainty rather than a contingency. This factoring had a specific and measurable effect. It slowed the Germans down, movement that was tactically necessary, but would have required crossing ground exposed to American observation was delayed or abandoned. Counterattacks that doctrine called for were deferred because the approach route crossed a fire corridor that the American FDC had clearly pre-registered. Positions that offered tactical advantages were not occupied because occupying them required movement that the Jabos would see and respond to. The German infantry was not broken, it was constrained. The combined arms system had constructed around every American position and every American line of advance an invisible perimeter of covered ground that could be crossed at cost, but only at cost, and where the cost was reliably imposed because the system was reliably present. The Feldpost brief, the German soldiers' letters home, after 1943 develop a specific vocabulary for American combined arms that is worth examining as a body of evidence. The letters are, because of the censorship system, indirect in their tactical descriptions, but the indirection itself is revealing. German soldiers describing combat against American forces do not write about facing infantry. They write about facing fire, about the impossibility of movement, about artillery that arrives before you have finished deciding to move, about aircraft that seem to know where you are before you have settled into your new position. One letter, cited in Stephen Fritz's study of the German frontline soldier, describes an attempted counterattack in Normandy in terms that strip the event of all tactical formality. We went forward 200 meters and then everything came at once. We did not reach our objective. Half the company is gone. The Americans do not fight fair. They do not fight fair. That phrase is not a complaint about rules. The German soldier writing it was not under the impression that war had rules about fairness. He was describing, in the only language available to him in that moment, the experience of encountering a tactical system so integrated, so responsive, and so reliably present that it violated his intuitive model of what infantry combat was supposed to feel like. The model built from 4 years of fighting on the Eastern Front, where the opponent was often formidable, but rarely this complete. The Americans did not fight fair because fair, in this context, meant that the infantryman across from you was supported by roughly the same system as you were. He wasn't, and the difference showed. German divisions committed to combat against American forces on the Western Front in 1944 and 1945 showed an attrition rate that consistently exceeded their replacement capacity. The German replacement system, already under severe strain from the simultaneous demands of the Eastern Front, the Italian campaign, and the strategic bombing campaign against the German homeland, could not fill vacancies fast enough to maintain division strength at the levels required for effective combined arms defense. This created a compounding problem. A division below strength cannot integrate its arms as effectively as a division at full strength because combined arms integration requires sufficient bodies at every node of the system. You need forward observers, trained, equipped, and positioned close enough to the enemy to observe targets. When forward observers are killed and replacements are untrained or absent, the artillery response slows. You need infantry armor communication, the radio-equipped officer who can talk to the tank commander in real time. When that officer is killed and his radio is destroyed, the tank and the infantry separate, and the separated tank and the separated infantry are each more vulnerable than the integrated team was. Attrition in a combined arms force is not linear. Losing 20% of your strength does not reduce your combat effectiveness by 20%. It reduces the integration that multiplies the effectiveness of each component, and integration, once disrupted, is not easily restored under fire. American commanders understood this, though perhaps not in those precise terms. The operational approach that General Omar Bradley and General Eisenhower pursued after the Normandy breakout sustained pressure across a broad front, denying German forces the opportunity to reconstitute, never allowing the Wehrmacht the operational pause that might allow it to reintegrate its shattered combined arms, was, whether consciously articulated this way or not, an attack on the German combined arms system as much as on the German physical position. Keep them moving, keep them under pressure, deny them the time to reorganize. Call the artillery, call the jabos, move the armor with the infantry. The system, kept running, would do the rest. And it did. From the Seine to the Rhine to the Elbe, the American combined arms machine moved forward at a pace that German defensive planning consistently failed to contain. Not because individual German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the system behind them was running out of the resources that integration requires, while the system behind the Americans was not. Hauptmann Werner Kolb was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He returned to a country that was, in the most literal physical sense, a ruin. The cities were stone. The roads were craters filled with rubble that had once been buildings. The administrative structure of the state he had served had been dismantled by occupation authorities who were, with varying degrees of competence and good faith, attempting to replace it with something that would not produce another war. He found his family. He found work. He did not return to the military. The new West German Bundeswehr was not established until 1955, and by then Kolb was in his mid-40s and had seen enough of what armies do when they meet each other in earnest. But he talked about the war, occasionally, in the private register that soldiers use with other soldiers when they are far enough from it to use language instead of silence. And what he talked about, with a consistency that his family remarked on, was not the battles he had fought or the men he had lost. He talked about the system. He could not explain it fully to people who had not been on the receiving end. He tried. He said that fighting the Americans was an experience unlike anything he had encountered in France in 1940 or Russia in 1941 and 1942. Not because the individual American soldier was better, Kolb was too professional to make that kind of sweeping judgment, but because the individual American soldier was never, in his experience, actually an individual in the tactical sense. He was always connected, always supported, always somewhere behind him and above him and to both flanks, attached to a system that would respond to his situation with a speed and a weight that the situation was very rarely able to survive. Kolb had understood this conceptually by the time he reached that farmhouse cellar in August 1944. What he had not fully understood, what he could not have understood until the war was over and the full scale of American industrial production became public knowledge, was why the system never ran out. It never ran out because behind the system was a country that had been building industrial infrastructure for a century. Factories that had made automobiles now made tanks. Factories that had made refrigerators now made artillery shells. Workers who had assembled washing machines now assembled radios. And all of it, the tanks, the shells, the radios, moved on a transportation network that was safe, intact, and growing. The German soldier said the Americans always seemed backed by machines. He was right. What he could not see from the farmhouse cellar was where the machines came from. They came from a civilization that had decided, long before the first shot of the war was fired, to build things, to build them well, to build them fast, and to build them in quantities that assumed not scarcity but abundance. That civilization, when it turned its full productive capacity to the specific problem of winning a war, built a machine that backed every infantryman in every foxhole on every front. The Germans saw the machine. They never saw the factory.